Historians and the Republic's crisis. Roman Republic, its downfall. History as inspiration and structural analysis. By 146 BCE, centuries of struggles were over and Rome was secure in her domination of the greater part of the Mediterranean area. Wars continued to be waged, but they were no more than the martial routine of hegemony. Yet, the Romans discovered that as their old problems faded, they faced new ones, which unfortunately could not be attacked simply by sending legions into the field. The troubling and unresolved problems were many. Unjust distribution of the vast public land acquired by conquest led to bitterly contested reform, attempts mainly by the Gracchi brothers. The vanishing of the family farm made many rootless people crowd into the slums of Rome, where they became a volatile element in Roman politics. A new class of men called the Equites had wealth, but in general lacked the power and influence of the senatorial aristocracy. Many Roman allies wanted citizenship, but received no satisfaction from the aristocratic senate or even from the urban poor, both groups that feared for their quite uneven privileges. Then the war against the desert king Jugurtha of Numidia, in itself a minor event, demonstrated the damage that luxury and wealth had done to the Roman society, particularly its elite class. There it showed pure discipline and a lack of endurance in the military, corruption in high places, and overreaching ambition in prominent individuals. After the Jugurthine War, Romans resumed internal strife, like that in the time of the Gracchi. In the civil war between the Populars under Marius and the Optimates under Sulla, 88 to 82 BCE, Romans killed and exiled Romans on a large scale. The Republic lived on as a mere shell in which the ambitions of men like Sulla, Pompey, and eventually Caesar governed events, often to the detriment of the Republic. For the first time, Romans became aware that their life differed greatly from that of their ancestors, and that their continuity of Roman tradition had been broken. That experience proved extremely disturbing. How did the past, seen as glorious and ideal, fit with the troubled present? Historical and quasi-historical works were written under the spell of this question. Old Rome as refuge and inspiration. In ages of political and social strife, the past perceived as a tranquil, good, and purposeful world has often become a source of pride, consolation, and guidance. It had happened in Greece, and now it happened in Rome. In this time, Cato had defended the Rome of traditional virtues, which, if it ever existed, was by now only a memory. Some Romans who looked fondly back to the old Rome found their nostalgia somewhat tantamount by a new antiquarianism. The contemporary of Cato and sponsor of Ennius of Rude, Fulvius Nobilior, had published a collection of Fasti. After 130 BCE, somebody, most likely Pontifex Maximus Publius Mucius Scaevola, compiled a collection of the Annals Maximi. Had Roman historians cared more for documentation, they could have found in these annals a rich source. The peculiar traditionalism which aimed at extolling old Rome found its historiographical expression in the detailed study of Roman antiquity, often with fanciful results persisted throughout the troubled age. And so Aelius Praeconius Stylo's guides and studies gave him a considerable reputation and greatly influenced Cicero. A student of Stylo, Marcus Terentius Varro, became the greatest of these antiquarian scholars. In his old age, he had the satisfaction of seeing the Augustan stabilization of contemporary Roman society in the image of old Rome. Varro, as has been previously mentioned, Marcus Terentius Varro, a conservative landowner of the senatorial class, loved Roman antiquity, and he wrote between 39 and 74 works on it. So brilliant was Varro's inventory of Roman culture that his interpretation of the Roman mythical age, as well as his date for the founding of Rome, 753 BCE, became canonical. Unfortunately, only a minor portion of his Roman Antiquities, which was the most historical work of them all, is known to us today. Aside from the antiquarian writings, historical works held to a less clear direction. The evocation of a greater civic consciousness may well have been the only unifying bond. Some historians yielded without objection to Greek influences. Gaius Fannius produced a somber account of strife-filled Rome, enhanced by Greek stylistic devices. His younger contemporary, Sempronius Aselio, a one-time military tribune, followed Polybius in going beyond the joys of pure narration to a search for motives and causes. In a sparse style and with stern admonitions, he tried and failed to influence his fellow citizens. Others, possibly influenced by the Hellenistic dramatic historians, wished to invoke in their audience an admiration for old Rome by means of dramatic exposition. Characteristically, one of the best known of them, Coelius Antipater, was not only a legal expert but also a rhetorical mentor for public figures. When he restricted his history to an account of the Second Punic War, he virtually assured his story of both dramatic quality and unity, and he proceeded to exploit that opportunity. Horrendous earthquakes destroying whole cities occurred as omnia of terrible things to come. A huge storm accompanied the transfer of Scipio's army to Africa, and he insisted that Scipio's army was so large that it virtually depopulated both Italy and Sicily, and that when the soldiers shouted, the birds fell dead to the ground. Later, Cornelius Sisenna, who also dramatized his theory of history, albeit in a more restrained manner, skillfully painted mood pictures. He particularly loved to describe the shouts of fighting soldiers, the clash of shields, and the massacre of victims. The reader was to re-experience fear, panic, mistrust, and ecstasy. Then there were the analytic writers, often called sullen Hellenists, grouped together according to the format of their writings. Gnaeus Gellius's tale of the Roman past was 30 or so books long, full of details on early life, much of it unreliable, however. Some of the analysts tried to maintain the continuity between their age and old Rome without following the antiquarians into Rome's mythological past. First we have Q. Claudius Quadragarius, finding the oldest account unreliable and less readable than he desired, reached back only to the invasion by the Gauls. L. Cornelius Sisenna wrote only contemporary history for the period from about 90 to 82 BCE, and primarily about the Italian or Social War. Both men linked up with Old Rome by their use of archaic Latin words and phrases. Two analytic accounts, Ab Urbe Condita, came from C. Licinius Macer and Valerius Antius Macer, who ended up a suicide after being successfully prosecuted by the praetor Cicero, wrote an unusually democratic account and has to be given credit for discovering a new source in the Libri Lente, or the Linen Books, which list magistrates. In comparison, Valerius Antius' work impresses as quasi-fictional, although it became quite popular. Sallust's analytical historiography. The gap between the Roman past, perceived as an ideal period, and the trouble-filled present bothered many Romans and their historians, yet explanations for it remained rare and shallow. Then in the 1st century BCE, Romans could learn about the systematic analysis of political affairs from Thucydides, whose work became fashionable, although he was studied much more for his style than for his substance. Polybius's and Posidonius of Apamea's reflections on the decay of states did not find acceptance either. A partial change of attitude came, however, with the works on recent Rome by Sallust. See Sallustius Crispus, who had been forced out of the public life by allegations that he had excessively enriched himself at the public's expense. Not having Cicero's ability to find consolation in philosophy, he seized on history writing as a substitute for his aborted public career. Coelius Antipater had introduced the Romans to the historical monograph. Now Sallust perfected that form with the war with Catiline and the war with Jugurtha, while his histories, which continued Lucius Cornelius Sisenna's narrative beyond 78 to 67 BCE, followed the traditional continuous narrative pattern. Sallust's two monographs carried his central message. Internal forces were destroying the Roman Republic. In the debate preceding the last war against Carthage, Scipio Nasica had warned that without a credible outside threat, Roman society would lose its tough fiber. Now, Sallust elaborated on that thesis. He said, quote, and I quote Sallust, "And when Carthage, Rome's rival in her quest for empire, had been annihilated, every land and sea lay open to her. It was then that fortune turned unkind and unconfounded all her enterprises. To the man who had so easily endured toil and peril, anxiety and adversity, The leisure and riches which are generally regarded as so desirable proved a burden and a curse. Growing love of money and the lust for power which followed it engendered every kind of evil. Avarice destroyed honor, integrity, and every other virtue, and instead taught men to be proud and cruel, to neglect religion, and to hold nothing too sacred to sell. Ambition tempted many to be false, to have one thought hidden in their hearts, another ready on their tongues, to become a man's friend or enemy not because they judged him worthy or unworthy, but because they thought it would pay them, and to put the semblance of virtues that they had not. At first these vices grew slowly and sometimes met with punishment. Later on, however, when the disease had spread like a plague, Rome changed." End quote. The war with Catiline, containing the story of the years from 66 to 63 BCE, demonstrated in Sallust the harmful changes in the Romans' elite's mentality. L. Sergius Catiline, brutal, ambitious, and totally corrupt, would have remained a footnote to history had it not been for Cicero's opposition and for Sallust's wish to demonstrate the corruption of the Roman collective fabric. The war against Jugurtha chronicled the same decay of the elite, that is, mostly the senatorial class, and within it, mainly the consular families. The Jugurthine War itself was a minor war of a mighty empire against a wily desert prince, and its strange turns could only be explained by what Jugurtha had said after his visit to Rome. Rome's elite was corrupt, money could buy it, and the arrogance of power could sway it. As for Sulla's state, it simply stabilized oligarchic rule. The masses, the plebs, could not turn the tide, and in Sallust's view they deserved even less trust. Sallust disagreed with his fellow citizens, who for a long time to come remained convinced that corruption was remediable by appealing to the moral sense of people, and that historians could issue such appeals. Sallust, possibly influenced by Thucydides and Polybius, searched for the causes of decadence, and at least tentatively entered into the area of systematic analysis, when he spoke briefly on the general fate of empires, as that was mirrored in the fate of Rome. And so we have a connection here from Thucydides to Polybius to Sallust. The process begins with the irresistible urge to make war and dominate. For the successful state, the reward of victory is hegemony, yet to gain an empire means also to acquire wealth, which immediately begins to corrupt the state and its citizens. Rome had reached her turning point with the destruction of Carthage. Since the Romans had done that, they had been left without a clear purpose, and no man really lives or gets any satisfaction out of life unless he devotes all his energies to some task and seeks fame by some notable achievement, or by the cultivation of some admirable gift. Luxury and wealth promptly corroded the Roman virtues over time. Sallust seemed to be left only with the melancholy task of describing how Rome became corrupt without Romans being able to stop it. Yet Sallust issued admonitions against letting melancholy prevail. Romans must not despair, complaining that they are naturally feeble and short-lived, or that it is chance and not merit that decides their destiny. Despite Sallust's own diagnosis of Rome's seemingly irremediable corruption through luxury and wealth, he appealed as a historian to his fellow citizens for proper actions. In all of this, Sallust refused, as other Roman historians would do, to expand the decadence through wealth, and that pattern into a wider theory on the development of states. Even for him, Rome was destined to be everlasting. In the end, no single aspect of Sallust's work secured his place among historians. That was accomplished by the fact that his work supported the bridge of reflective and critical history writing, which spanned a sea of analysts and narrators and reached from Cato to Tacitus. History divorced from Rome's fate. Biography as history. Cato had warned Romans to no avail against the harm done to a republic by a cult of personalities. Individualism of a different kind had all been deeply embedded in Roman life. From early times, Romans had praised the merits of members of their gentes and families and celebrated the deeds of those who had served the republic. In each case, the individual's achievements were used as examples for a proper life, and the practice continued. But now, with the cohesion of Roman society diminished, the desire for individual recognition became, to a higher degree, a function of ambition, lust for power, craving for fame. These traits marked especially the more and more numerous memoirs and autobiographies. The writing of biographies had by then reached a sophisticated level in Roman times. In the Hellenistic East, the practice was supported by the rhetoricians, who cherished biographical writings as opportunities for the expression of joy, tragedy, praise, and condemnation, and by philosophers who loved to use biographies as collections of examples for problems in proper conduct. In Rome, The time of strife with its own cult of personalities created a most favorable climate for biographical writing. It thus is not surprising that the Greek biographical tradition found in the 1st century BCE its first Latin representative, Cornelius Nepos. He knew that the reputation of biography was not that high. He said, "I do not doubt that there will be many Atticus who will think this kind of writing trifling in its nature, and not sufficiently adapted to the characters of eminent men." End quote. And he worried about transgressing the line between history and biography, and indicated where it was drawn. Quote, "For I fear that if I begin to give a full account of his actions, I may seem not to be relating his life, but to be writing a history." But Nepos' simple style and his looking at the past through individual lives proved to be popular with his contemporaries and with language students of future centuries. Autobiographical works became fashionable in the age of strife when persons felt it necessary to show that their lives had been well spent, or wanted to justify their actions, and when a sense of personal fulfillment was no longer the matter of course result of a public career. Such was the case with the autobiographical works of Q. Lutatius, Catullus, and P. Rutilius Rufus. More substantial were Sulla's commentaries, wherein he justified his actions, when he proclaimed that the gods and fortune had selected him to carry out their mandates. He foretold something about future attitudes. As for C. Julius Caesar, he wrote his commentaries not in the retrospect, but in his way to the top. At that point, he could hardly proclaim his designation for leadership by fortune. Indeed, in his commentaries, he even avoided the word I, and referred to himself in the third person, by name. Actually, the commentaries were not even a true autobiography. They aimed to inform those who mattered in Rome about Caesar's campaigns, particularly his successes and brilliance. Caesar, well trained in rhetoric, accomplished this aim splendidly. In direct and simple language, he gave an account of his wars in Gaul and his excursions into England and the German area. Given the propagandistic purpose of this first extant Latin history, its accuracy is astonishing. Much later, at the peak of his career, Caesar already depicted himself in his Civil War as never having made a mistake and as favored by fortune. History as scholarly enterprise. Rome had bestowed on the learned historians of the Greek East a world of peace in which scholarship continued to prosper, particularly in Alexandria. In that area, historians were more often than not grammarians and rhetors. Many of them studied critically the traditional texts. In that context, they addressed a few methodological issues, mostly concerning the question of accuracy. Exemplary results were the elaborate, if not pedantic, studies of the Homeric epics, such as the sophisticated analysis of the Iliad's catalogue of ships by Apollodorus of Athens. Among the Hellenistic scholars, such scholarly attention to the epics also passed as the appropriate expression of reverence. Despite a growing influence of Greek intellectual and artistic works, Rome remained a poor soil for cultivating the theoretical and speculative attitudes and interests which Greeks cherished. In the whole period from 150 BCE to Augustus, there occurred only one noteworthy discussion of a few theoretical issues of historiography. Characteristically, during this 150-year period, the discussant, Marcus Tullius Cicero, was a master of Greek rhetoric, who also was deeply engaged in public affairs. Cicero urged his fellow Romans to study and emulate the Greek achievements in history writing, and praised those Roman historians who paid proper attention to veritas, which was good descriptions, motives, deeds, causes, and sequences in time. His was to be a last valiant call for histories which instructed people on how they could be better citizens of the Republic and lead a more constructive life. But in order to be effective, these histories had to be truthful. Therefore, the word veritas. For who does not know history's first law to be that an author must not dare to tell anything but the truth, and second, that he must make bold to tell the whole truth, that there must be no suggestion of partiality anywhere in his writings, nor of malice. And of course, we can see that from Cicero's De Orator. On occasion, this Ciceronian concept of truth was even too stringent for Cicero himself. At one time, he exhorted another writer, Lucius. So I frankly ask you again and again to eulogize my actions with even more warmth than perhaps you feel, and in that respect to disregard the canons of history. Bestow on our love even a little more than may be allowed by truth. Cicero was diverted here from his demand for unadorned truth by a second ideal, the effectiveness of history as teacher, which required that historians must create artistic compositions and not dull annals. In doing so, historians could, just as other writers, arrange and select their material in a manner which would produce a useful memory of the past and lead readers to act properly. Cicero's history still remained at a safe distance from fictional tales or falsifications. The ideal remained a history which is true, quote, bears witness to the passing of the ages, sheds light upon reality, gives life to recollection and guidance to human existence, and bears tidings of ancient days, end quote. There the reflection on history writing ended. Both the Roman temper and the limits of rhetoric confirmed the range of theoretical discussions. Cicero's reflections were as theoretical as ancient historians could muster. A people whose state dominated most of the oikoumene, and for whom history was the story of the climb to that hegemony, produced historical works of greater or lesser accuracy, but much certainty of purpose. Historical truth as pure reconstruction, removed from pragmatic aims and resulting from dispassionate study, was foreign to all Roman historians. The past as viewed from the Greek East. The Greek East had been conquered, but the Greeks were not touched greatly by the Roman internal turmoil, and because Greek historians were not captivated by the Roman civil war and discord, their interest led them in many directions. They generated an amorphous body of historical works ranging from antiquarian compilations to nostalgic evocations, to school text for grammar and rhetoric students, to moral lesson pieces, to high-class gossip, and finally to new reconstructions of the past. There was a question of why Greeks now lived under the umbrella of a Panhellenism imposed by the Romans. The exile Polybius had credited constitutional arrangements, Tyche, and a superb civic spirit with Rome's success, also known as fortune. But most Greeks spoke simply in terms of a drop-off from former glory since the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE, for which they variously blamed the unwise treatment of allies and non-citizens, envy, greed, corruption, and divisiveness. But even in their period of discontent, Greek scholars prominent among them were Aelius Aristides, Dio of Prusa, and Philostratus, found their views on Panhellenism and the polis at odds. On the one hand, they praised past attempts at unity and harmony among Greeks, and on the other they celebrated the old Greece of the separate city-states, particularly Athens and Sparta, because it had the greatness which the present sadly lacked. In Athens and other Attican cities, the long-ago victories over Persians at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea were celebrated annually, while in Sparta the battles of Thermopylae and of Plataea were commemorated at their anniversaries. And so, despite all local and regional preferences, it became obvious to thoughtful observers that Roman rule was making one world out of what had been merely a geographical unit. Now historians had an opportunity to weld the historical accounts of diverse Mediterranean peoples into a unit, if they found the proper interpretation. Polybius had succeeded because he had accepted Roman hegemony as the common goal of the events of the last few centuries, something most Greeks were loath to do. But his histories were not truly comprehensive, either in the sense of dealing with the earlier past of peoples, or in the sense of dealing with areas not directly linked with the Roman story. Polybius's work was universal only to the degree the Roman state itself had grown to be universal by 140 BCE. His subject matter, Rome's creation of an oikoumene by force, led Polybius to emphasize campaigns, battles, treaties, constitutional arrangements, and political maneuvers. Could there be a unified account of the Mediterranean past with or oikoumene, inhabitant Earth? Could there be a unified account of this inhabited Earth, or oikoumene, without the unity through Rome, theme which Greeks disliked? Apollodorus of Athens tried to write one and failed. His Chronica, telling of the past of various Mediterranean peoples, from the fall of Troy to about 120 BCE, had iambic meter, some scholarly standards, but no unitary concept. It turned into a panoramic view of explorations, migrations of peoples, states, wars, artistic creations, intellectual events, and became a handbook for scholars in intellect and art. 3/4 of a century after Pausanias of Apamea brought forth a history of the Mediterranean area between 143 BCE and Sulla, which encompassed all the peoples who mattered and dealt with the realms of intellect and art. His stoic cosmopolitanism broadened his perspective and enabled him to discuss with detachment the rise and fall of empires. In the end, the rhetor Castor of Rhodes had the most influence with his chronicle of events, from the Assyrians to 60 BCE, a chronicle by Castor of Rhodes which was based on Apollodorus and took the form of chronological tables. There, lined up side by side and synchronized by years, were the lists of kings of Assyria, Media, Lydia, Persia, and Macedonia, kings and priests of Sicyon, and archons of Athens. The work hardly made for good reading, but its encyclopedic and quasi-textbook qualities assured the Chronicle a strong influence on such diverse writers as Varro, Sextus Julius Africanus, and Eusebius. The later, Eusebius, used Castor's table-type comprehensive history when he created his Christian World Chronicle, and with it helped shape the world chronicles of the late ancient and medieval periods.